Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 11, Supply Chain Management. In this chapter, we're going to ask the following question. What measures can we use to evaluate the performance of supply chains? To answer this, we're going to use four different measures: average aggregated inventory value, the cost of goods sold, inventory turnover, and the weeks of supply or days of supply. The first question, what's a supply chain? So let's take an example. Suppose I want to buy a handbag. So I go to Macy's. I enter one of the stores and I see lots of handbags from lots of brands. In this case, I am the customer and the store at Macy's is a retailer. Where does the retailer get all the handbags? He buys them from a wholesaler. So let's say that there is a wholesaler in Miami and he buys all the bags from a supplier in South America and he buys them in bulk. And since he buys handbags in huge quantities, he gets them at a lower price. He gets discounts and he sells them to all the retail stores in the eastern part of the United States. Now let's look at the manufacturer in South America. To produce handbags, he needs lots of materials. He needs leather, he needs buttons, he needs zippers. So he gets all of them from suppliers. So this is a supply chain of a handbag. There are suppliers, a manufacturer, a wholesaler, and a retailer, and a customer. And the main question we have in supply chain management is how to manage these members so we can reduce the cost of production, the cost of delivery, and the cost of storage. So today we're going to focus on how to evaluate the performance of a supply chain. Let's think about performance measures. What performance measures do we use to evaluate a company's finance? What numbers do you look at? We look at the stock price, earnings, revenue, and return on assets and return on net worth. And the most frequently used ones are earnings and the return on assets, ROA. How about supply chain? What performance measures do we use to evaluate a company's supply chain? We use the aggregated average inventory value, the cost of goods sold, the inventory turnover, and the days of supply. And the most frequently used number is probably the inventory turnover. So in the rest of this chapter, we're going to talk about how to compute these quantities. Let's start with average aggregated inventory value. AAIV represents the dollar value of the average inventory. So in other words, it represents how much money we are investing in inventory. So for example, let's say that a stationery store has 100 pencils in inventory and it purchased each pencil for $2 from a supplier. What's its AAIV? What's the value of inventory? Each pencil is worth $2. We spent $2 to get one pencil, and there are 100 of them, so it's 2 times 100, $200. AAIV of this store is $200. Now let's think about why we use the word aggregate. In a store, there may be multiple unit items. There may be more than one item. So in that case, we'll have to compute the value of each item and add them up. So that's why we use the aggregate. Next, why do you use the word average? Remember, the inventory level fluctuates over time. So when we say that a store has 100 pencils, it doesn't mean that inventory is always 100 pencils. all the time. It means the daily average is 100 pencils. So for example, let's say that we observed the inventory of pencils every day over a year. So on the first day, we had 107 pencils. On the second day, we had 101 pencils. On the third day, we had 98 pencils. And then we received some, and then 94, and etc. And if you compute, so inventory fluctuates over time like this. And if we compute the daily average, if we add them up, add this up, and divide it by 365, you will get the average inventory level. And that's what we mean by the inventory level, average inventory level. So when we compute AAIV, we're going to use this number, the average inventory level. So here's the formula for AAIV. If we have multiple items, you count the number of units of each item, and you multiply by how much you invested to purchase each unit or to produce each unit, and you're going to add them up across multiple items. So let's take an example. Let's say that there are 7 types of parts in a factory. The first 3 parts are raw materials. Part number 4 is work in process. The last 3 parts are finished products. And we know the average inventory level of each part, and we know the unit value, how much you have to invest to produce each unit. And we need to compute AAIV, right? So now what's the first thing we need to do? We have to take the average inventory level and we have to multiply by 3. And since we have multiple units, we have to repeat this for each unit and we have to add them up. So here's the answer. If you multiply the first two, you'll get 45,000. 2,500 times 5 equals 12,500. And we add them up, you get 360,500. So that's the AAIV. So what's the meaning of this number? What does this quantity tell us about? It tells you that the value of inventory you have at any point in time is 360,500. So can we use this number to make a conclusion? So for example, suppose company A has a higher AAIV than company B. Which one do you think runs its supply chain more efficiently? The one with a higher AAIV or the one with a lower AAIV? The one with a lower AAIV, because a higher AAIV means higher inventory value. That means a higher cost of holding inventory. The next one is the cost of goods sold. The cost of goods sold represents the amount of money invested for the products that are sold each year. So again, COG, cost of goods sold, is also the value of inventory. But what's the difference between the cost of goods sold and AAIV? When we compute AAIV, we used the average inventory level. So it tells us how much money is tied up in inventory at any point in time. But when we compute the cost of goods sold, we're going to use all the inventory that's sold throughout the year, that's sold for a year. So it tells us how much value was tied up through how much inventory was sold within a year. So let's take an example. Last year, a stationery store sold 1,000 pencils. So this is the total number of pencils sold within a year. And the wholesale price was $2. That means the store spent $2 to purchase each pencil. And they sold 2,000 notebooks, and the wholesale price was $5. So 2,000 is the total number of notebooks that were sold for a year. Now, what's its cost of goods sold last year for a year? So we take 1,000 times 2 plus 2,000 times 5. 1,000 times 2, that's the value of the pencils sold last year, plus 2,000 times 5, that's going to be 12,000. That's the cost of goods sold last year. So here is the formula for the cost of goods sold. You take the number of units sold within a year and multiply by how much you have to spend to purchase it or to produce it, and you add them up over multiple items. And to compute, remember, to compute the cost of goods sold, you need to use the price charged by your suppliers, not the price you charge your customers. So use the wholesale price, not the selling price. So for example, a grocery store sells canned tuna, and each can is sold for $2. That's the selling price for your customers. And the store purchases the cans from a supplier for $1.50 each. So this is the wholesale price, right? So about 50 cans are sold every week. What's the weekly cost of goods sold? So how many cans are sold every week? 50. And times how much do you spend to get them from your supplier? 1.5, right? So the answer is 50 times 1.5, about 75. The next one is the number of weeks of supply. The number of weeks of supply is a way of expressing the inventory level. For example, if someone says you have 5 weeks of supply, that means you have enough inventory to last over 5 weeks. Or it will take 5 weeks until you run out. So how can we compute the number of weeks of supply? Let's say an average of $50,000 is tied up in inventory. So what does this number represent? This is the value of your inventory at any point in time. So this is AAIV. And the cost of goods sold per week is $10,000. How many weeks of supply were held in inventory? In other words, how many weeks does it take until you run out? So let's start with $50,000. At any point in time, your inventory is worth $50,000. What happens after a week? 1 week later. How much inventory do you sell? The cost of goods sold per week is $10,000. So during a week, you sell inventory that's worth $10,000. So your inventory is now worth $40,000. Next, what happens? 2 weeks later? 2 weeks later. Again, you sell inventory that's worth $10,000. So your inventory is worth $30,000. So how many weeks does it take until you run out? 5 weeks, right? So the answer is 5 weeks. We have 5 weeks of supply. And can you derive a formula for the number of weeks of supply? So in this example, what did you do to compute this? You took 50,000 and you divided by 10,000. So in other words, you took AAIV and you divided by the cost of goods sold. So the formula for the number of days of supply, number of weeks of supply, is you took AAIV and you divided by the cost of goods sold. Cost of goods sold per week. So that's the first formula. The cost of weeks of supply is this. And also, similarly, you can find the formula for the number of days of supply, and that's AAIV divided by the cost of goods sold per week, per day. Now, the next item is inventory turnover. How can we interpret inventory turnover? If someone says your inventory turned 3 times last year, it means you sold 3 times something that's 3 times the average aggregate inventory value last year. So for example, if the cost of goods sold last year is 2 million, and the average aggregate inventory value is 500,000, AIV was 0.5 million, what's the inventory turnover? Okay, so your AAIV was your cost of goods sold. Cost of goods sold was $2 million and your AAIV was 0.5. And what's your inventory turnover? In other words, how many times do you turn inventory over a year, right? So for example, let's say you sold 500,000. You sold 500,000, then you turn your inventory once. 0.5 million. You turn your inventory once. Turn inventory once. And what happens if you sell another 0.5 million? Then you turn your inventory twice. What happens if you sell another 0.5 million? You turn your inventory 3 times. And another 0.5 million? You turn your inventory 4 times. So at this point, you sold $2 million inventory that's worth $2 million. That means you 1 year has passed because your cost of goods sold for a year was $2 million. So during this time, how many times did you turn your inventory? 4 times, right? So your answer is 4. So from this question, we can find a formula for inventory turnover. What did you do to compute the inventory turnover? You took $2 million, which was the cost of goods sold, and you divided by the average aggregate inventory value. Right? So your inventory turnover is COGS divided by AAIV. Now let's try a couple of examples. The Eagle Machine Company averages $2 million in inventory last year. So it just tells you how much your inventory is worth at any point in time. So what does it represent? 2 equals AAIV, right? So let's go to AAIV is $2 million. Now, and the cost of goods sold last year was $10 million. Cost of goods sold was $10 million. If the company has 52 business weeks per week, how many weeks of supply were held in inventory? And what was the inventory turnover? So now let's go to the formula for the number of weeks of supply. Number of weeks of supply is AAIV divided by the cost of goods sold per week, right? So weeks of supply equals AAIV divided by the cost of goods sold per week. So AAIV was 2 divided by the cost of goods sold per week. We know the cost of goods sold per year, right? So which was this was the per year, which was 10. So we need to convert this to the cost of goods sold per week, right? Since there are 52 weeks in a year, you can just divide it by 52. That's the number of weeks of supply. Now let's go to the second question. So let's go to the second question. What was the inventory turnover? Let's go to the formula for the inventory turnover. It's the cost of goods sold per year divided by AAIB. Okay, so inventory turnover is cost of goods sold per year divided by AAIB. So the cost of goods sold is 10, AAIB is 2, so that's equal to 5. Okay, let's check the answers. Now let's try another example. A recent accounting statement showed total inventories, raw materials plus work in progress plus finished goods to be $6,821,000. So what does this number represent? Total inventory, so this is AAIV, 6821. Yeah, so your AAIV was 6821,000. And next. And this year's cost of goods sold is 19.2 million. The cost of goods sold was 19.2 million. How many zeros are there in a million? There are 6 zeros, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now the company operates 52 weeks per year. How many weeks of supply are being held? What's the inventory turnover? Okay. Number of weeks of supply. Number of weeks of supply is AAIV divided by the cost of goods sold per week. Number of weeks of supply equals AAIV divided by the cost of goods sold per week. So that's equal to 6821,000 divided by, now we know the cost of goods sold per year, so you need to convert this to the cost of goods sold per week, so you just need to divide it by 52. The second question was inventory turnover. The formula for inventory turnover is the cost of goods sold divided by AAIV. So it's 192 divided by AAIV, 6821,000. Okay. Now this one I left this as a as an in-class assignment, so you can try this on your own. Now the last topic I want to cover is the relationship between the inventory turnover and the days of supply. So the relationship between the two is as follows. Inventory turns is equal to 386 divided by the number of days of supply. Why? Let's look at the following example. Suppose a company keeps 30 days of supply in inventory. Compute its inventory turns per year, right? So there are 365 days in a year. In the first 30 days, in the first 30 days, the company keeps 30 days of supply. That means in 30 days, it turns its inventory once, right? And in the second 30 days, in the next 30 days, it turns its inventory again. And every 30 days, it turns its inventory. So how many times does it turn inventory? How many of these can we fit in 365 days? The answer is 365 divided by 30. Okay, so 365 divided by the number of days of supply, that's how many times you turn your inventory. Okay, this is everything we have today, and I'll see you next time.